I am an early career biostatistician, and I'm also the Vice President of Membership for the Statistical Society of Australia. I have an interest in peer review because I'm just starting out and very new to it. So we decided to host this seminar as a sort of introduction for early career researchers, but for everyone who's interested into doing peer review and how to get started. So we're very lucky today to be joined by Dr. Myra McGuinness and Professor Andrew Forbes, Professor Alan Welsh and Professor Catherine Lee, who are going to be making up our panel. First, we're going to have a presentation from Myra on peer review, and then we'll have a bit of a panel Q&A. So I'll just introduce Myra first of all. Dr. Myra McGuinness is the head of biostatistics at the Centre for Eye Research Australia and is passionate about incorporating best practice research methodology when designing research studies and assessing results. Myra has an extensive experience in both writing and reviewing journal articles. So thanks for joining us, Myra, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Rihanna. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm actually presenting from the lands of the Boonwurrung people this afternoon, but I know we're all scattered out, so I do acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that you're all located on today also. So I'll be giving a brief introduction to each of the points that you can see on the screen. I should mention that I'm not on any editorial boards, so I'll be giving an overview of these themes, but the panel with us today are the real experts in this space. So I'm looking forward to listening in on their discussion after this presentation. So I'll start by saying that peer review is an important part of the quality control process for scientific research, and it's thought to be vital for maintaining the credibility of research output. So not only does it keep our researchers and publishers accountable, but it often results in amendments to manuscripts that can improve the quality of published literature. So obviously there are altruistic reasons for getting involved in this process. You might want to be of service to your professional community. We know that any system of appraisal requires a diverse pool of people for it to work optimally. And as I stated earlier, changes in response to reviewers' comments can improve the clarity and transparency, and that's going to benefit the wider scientific community. So in addition, I believe that critically appraising other people's work will make you a better researcher, and that if you think like a reviewer, then that's going to help you increase the chance that you'll get positive reviews on your own manuscripts. So I think as researchers, some things about our own studies, they often seem so obvious that we don't include them in our papers. So it's important to think about how someone else will interpret our work and just be extra explicit about every single step of the way. So reviewing manuscripts also gives you access to information about advances in your field, and sometimes that happens before the wider community is aware of them. Often we're so busy that we only have time to read the abstract of a new paper, but being a peer reviewer really forces us to look at those details and consider the concepts in more depth. So this will result in a more thorough understanding of your own field. Being a reviewer also gives you insights into the priorities of different journals, and that can be helpful when you're submitting your own manuscripts. It exposes you to different ways of expressing your ideas, which again can improve your own academic writing. So when you're a peer reviewer, you come to the attention of the editor, and it can build your reputation in the field. I've personally been asked to write 3 invited commentary pieces for JAMA Ophthalmology, purely as a result of manuscript reviews that I've conducted. This might not be so relevant for the people when you're being accredited by the SSA, but I've gained continuing education points for reviews to maintain my accreditation with the Orthoptic Association board, but I don't think that the SSA has this program in place at the moment. Journal review also demonstrates service to the scientific community on your CV when you're applying for jobs or promotions or grant applications. So let's have a brief look at some of the things that are involved in conducting a review. The Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics uses a single blinded review system, and that's pretty common. The reviewer can see the author details, but the authors don't know who's conducted the review, and they think that reviewers will probably feel more confident to air their criticisms this way. In double-blinded reviews, neither the authors nor the reviewers' details are disclosed to the other party, and this makes it less likely that biases will impact on reviewer comments. Open reviews have become much more common since online-only journals have been around. Journals such as BMC Research Methodology, which sometimes we'll use to publish our statistical methodology papers, will use this system. And depending on the journal, you'll be able to see the originally submitted manuscript, the reviewer comments, and the replies to the reviewers on the journal website once that paper has been published. And so this allows readers to assess the level of involvement that reviewers and editors have had in shaping the manuscript, which, I think is kind of good, because often I have changed things in manuscripts that I've submitted just to please reviewers. So I don't know how much people will actually go back and look at those originally submitted papers or not, but I think it's helpful. The last type of review that I have up here is new to me. Journals like BMJ Open allow post-publication reviews. And I guess these reviews will share some of the similarities with invited commentary pieces, as well as letters to the editor. In the past, we might have, found something unusual in the methodology of a paper and written to share our thoughts on that. But now we can do that in a post-publication review. And this is something that you might also consider if you're a new researcher and you want to get your name into the field. It's a way of getting your name out there. So to start with, you should always check the scope of the journal that you're reviewing for and look at the instructions for reviewers on their website, because they will differ from journal to journal. You might find it useful to use a reviewing template, and the one that I've got on the screen here has been downloaded from the Publon's website. I also highly recommend using reporting checklist. Guidelines are really useful to justify why you have recommended specific revisions. So, for example, if you're performing a statistical review related to an applied biomedical study, the sample guidelines could be useful. So these guidelines relate to statistical reporting in applied research, but they're not really suitable for statistical methodology papers. So these guidelines list a total of 98 checklist items, but they're not all going to be relevant to every paper. I'm not aware of any checklists for statistical methodology papers, but there are tutorial papers out there that you could adapt into a checklist. This one on the screen is a paper on simulation studies from 2019 by Tim Morris and his colleagues, and I definitely use this as a checklist when I'm drafting my manuscripts, but it might also be useful for those of you who are reviewing the manuscripts. I've listed a few of the common reporting guidelines for health research on this slide, but you should go to the Equator Network website if you see that there's more, to see if there's a more specific extension which is relevant to the study that you're working on. So you can use other people's reviews as examples of how to structure and word your own review. You can find examples in response to your own submitted manuscripts, on websites of journals with open review policies. And if you have submitted a review, it's always informative to look at the comments submitted by the editor and by the other peer reviewer to see how they've differed from your own comments. So there's several ways you could conduct a review, and more information on these methods is available in the reviewer courses that I'll share at the end of the presentation. The method that I'm presenting has 4 steps. And the first step is the initial read through. So in this part, you take notes on your initial thoughts about the title, the abstract, and the references. And at this stage, you're also thinking about who the target audience is, whether the research question is clearly stated, and if the methods are appropriate to address the research question, and also think about whether the findings are novel. The next step is to write a detailed review of the content, and that includes what you might consider to be major comments. So these are comments on whether the methodology and analysis were appropriate and whether the results support the conclusions. So following on from that, you can do a detailed review of readability and make what you consider to be minor comments. So in this section, you should consider the flow, the structure and grammar, as well as looking at the formatting of figures and tables, which some reason I always find a lot to write about how they should be reformatting their figures and tables. I think that's just my personality. Lastly, you'll write a short summary of your overall thoughts, and that includes the strengths of the manuscript. So once you've written that summary, usually move that up to the start of your review, and that will be read first when you submit the review to the journal. It's recommended that you number and give page and line references for each of your comments. And one acronym to help you provide constructive feedback is SEAS. And this stands for make a statement, explain your reasons, provide an example, and suggest a solution. So many reviewers believe that it's their job to find faults, but it's more useful to the editor if you appraise critically while being polite, honest, and constructive. And so this includes pointing out the strengths and the novelty of the study that you're praising. So there is debate about whose job it should actually be to decide whether to publish a manuscript or not. So you should only give a decision recommendation if required to do so by the specific journal. And depending on the journal, your options might include accept, which is very rare for a first submission. You could recommend minor revisions if only small edits are necessary. And major revisions will be necessary if you think the study needs to be reanalyzed. Or you could recommend to reject if the paper is fatally flawed. And by fatally flawed, examples of this might be if there are methodological errors or ethical concerns. In one of the reviewer courses that I recently completed, they did also suggest that lack of new knowledge was a reason to suggest. However, I think personally that it is important to be able to replicate previous findings. So I think it's important to point this out to the editor and then let them decide on whether this is a reason for rejection or not, depending on the priorities of the journal. And I think, you know, really high impact journals, probably you don't want things that have already been established. So it really does depend on the journal whether the novelty of the information comes into account. So if you ever suspect plagiarism, fabrication or falsification, then you should let the editor know for sure. The editor will then go back to the researchers and ask for evidence of their findings, such as statistical code and output or other primary research records. But it's important not to include these accusations in a review that the authors will see. Just let the author know and let them handle it. So that leads us on to a few more ethical issues around the peer review process. So let's start with an easy one. So there might be some people out there who are asking whether you should feel obliged to participate in peer review. So if you're asking that, you should ask yourself whether you believe that peer review is necessary to uphold the standards of scientific evidence. And if you get an invitation to review, ask yourself whether you have experience in at least one area of the manuscript, and if you're free of conflicts of interest, and if you think that you can complete the review by the due date. So if your answer to those questions is yes, then you should be contributing to the peer review process. So remember, you don't need to be an expert in all areas covered in the manuscript. And if you have been asked to do a review and you're willing but you're unsure of any of those points, then you should let the editor know and they can help you decide. So these are the types of conflicts that you should declare to an editor if you get an invitation. You should avoid reviewing papers from collaborators and colleagues. You should avoid competing papers on the exact topic that you're currently working on. And this way you can't be accused of unfairly blocking them or using their work in your own manuscript without referencing it. And again, if you're interested in reviewing and you think you might have a conflict, then declare it to the editor and let them decide. I did recently have this issue where the senior author of a paper that I was asked to review is the senior author on another paper that I'm working on. We don't work together in the same location. It just happened to be a collaborative process. And I let the editor know that, but I think that they were so stuck for reviewers that they were happy that I would remain impartial. And especially given it was completely different subject matter to what I'm currently working on. Even if you think you can be impartial when reviewing, there's always the risk of unconscious bias, or in the absence of actual bias, there's a risk of perception of bias. There have been some studies that have shown inconsistencies between reviewers' narrative descriptions and their overall recommendation for publication. And one theory is that this could result in reviewers being more harsh towards authors from other countries or from less prestigious institutions or towards authors of another gender. So it is important to avoid these biases when we do have access to demographic data in single-blinded or open reviews. So all of us here should be aware of publication bias, and we're all aware of the issues with null hypothesis testing, so I won't go into that now. But I did want to make the point that findings of equivalence can also be important, and they can contribute to clinical decision-making, and in the case of statistical methodology papers, to statistical decision-making. So we should be aware of this when making our own recommendations. When considering the volume of reviews that you should be conducting, it's helpful to keep in mind that each one of your published papers has been reviewed by at least 2 people, and possibly more if that paper has been rejected from another journal first. So therefore, it's been suggested that you review 2 to 3 papers for every paper that you publish as a first author. It's also important to let the editor know as soon as possible if you get an invitation but can't accept, because we all know what it's like as an author waiting for our decision and trying to get those publications into our CVs. So what about the situation where you've been sent a manuscript and after reading the abstract, you can already tell that you're probably going to reject? Hopefully the editors are not sending you papers of this quality. But when deciding how long you should spend writing the review, think about what level of feedback the editor needs to make a decision, and also what level of feedback you would appreciate as an author. So in one of the reviewing courses that I completed, an editor recommended that reviews should be approximately 1 to 3 single-spaced pages in length, and that might take you about 3 hours to complete. It's important not to disclose anything you learned while conducting a review, but you can consult a colleague for specific advice. So for example, if there's a specific lab test that you've never seen before, you can clarify that methodology or interpretation of that test with a colleague. And you can ask the editor for permission to perform a co-review if you'd like either a supervisor or a student to help you. If you wanted to look at these topics in more detail, you can read the ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, which have been published by the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. So I just wanted to go over a couple of tips for getting your foot in the door for those of you who haven't reviewed much in the past. One way to get involved could be to create a profile on a website such as Publons or ORCID. On those websites, you can specify your area of interest and which journals you're interested in. And larger journals, I think I think the BMJ is one example. They'll also have portals that you can register your interest. If you are going to do this, make sure that any of your other online profiles, such as Google Scholar and LinkedIn, are up to date in case the editors do a search on you. You can ask your supervisor to name you as a suggested reviewer for an article that they've been asked to review but don't have time. And they might also be able to give you feedback on your review before you submit it. But just a quick reminder that you do need to ask the editor for permission if you plan to do a co-review. Another step could be to email an editor directly with your CV explaining your area of expertise. If you are going to do this, it will help if you've already published or presented on this topic. And it will also help if you're a member of the professional organisation that publishes the journal. So once you have completed the review, you'll get an email to confirm your submission. And for the majority of journals, there is no payment for performing a peer review, although there are a couple of exceptions for high profile journals. And an important reason for this is that it would make publish even more expensive than it already is. And we know that less well-sourced groups already find it difficult to cover some publishing costs, especially for those open access journals. Some journals do offer discounts on article processing charges if you review for them. And I actually received a book of poems from Acta Ophthalmologica one year. But for the most part, I think the most that you get from doing these reviews, apart from all the reasons that I listed at the start, listing, being able to list it on your CV, etc., the most that you'll get is the warm, fuzzy feelings of contributing to your professional community. So I do recommend that you keep a record of all of your reviews to put on your CV, but remember you can't name the paper in your CV if it was conducted as a blind review. Publon's profile, the number of your reviews conducted will be automatically updated if the journal is affiliated with Publon's. You can also add reviews that you've done for other journals by submitting your confirmation email, which I have not done. Orchid also has this function, but I don't think it will automatically update as many papers as the Publon's profile, purely for the journals that I've been reviewing for. So if you wanted to look at reviewing in more detail, you can go to the Wiley website, and they're the people who publish the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics. They've got detailed resources for reviewers, and also put together the Reviewer Academy course, which goes for about an hour. And I've also listed a couple more options for free online courses that you could do if you wanted to look at peer review in more detail. If you want a certificate at the end of the Publon course, you will need to find a mentor who can sign off on all the course material. However, you can still do it without a mentor, but you just don't get the certificate at the end. So that's the end of the formal presentation. So I'll hand back to Rihanna, and she'll be moderating the panel discussion and question time for you.
Thanks very much, Mara. That was a great presentation and really good advice, particularly for me about the co-review. I recently undertook my first peer review as a co-review and found it was a really useful way to getting started in peer review. So now we're moving on to the panel discussion session, section of the seminar. I'd just like to formally introduce the panelists. We have three amazingly experienced statisticians here at our disposal today. Professor Kate Lee is a senior biostatistician at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute with over 15 years experience in the design, planning and analysis of randomised trials and observational studies. Her methodological interest is in multiple imputation for dealing with missing data and adaptive clinical trial designs. Kate has reviewed papers for a range of both applied and statistical journals. She served as associate editor for statistical editor for the journal series Pediatric Anesthesia from 2015 to 2018 and is currently an associate editor for Statistics in Medicine. Professor Andrew Forbes is the current head of the Biostatistics Unit in the School of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at Monash University. He has research interests in design and analysis of cluster randomized trials, interrupted time series designs, and the application of causal modeling principles to practical problems. He has been an associate editor of statistical methods in medical research for over 10 years. And Professor Alan Welch, last but not least, is the E.J. Hannon Professor of Statistics at the Australian National University Research School of Finance, Actuarial Studies and Statistics. Alan has received multiple awards for his research on statistical inference, statistical modelling and robustness, and the analysis of sample surveys. Alan is a former editor-in-chief of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics and is currently a co-editor of Biometrics. So welcome, Andrew, Kate and Alan. We're so glad that you could join us today. I wanted to start with some questions. First of all, I'm going to direct a question to each of you, but if you have something else to say or add, please feel free to jump in. So Alan, I'll start with you. What constitutes a good methodology paper? We've heard a little bit about applied papers, but obviously applied papers in statistics are very different from methodology papers. And is novelty the top criteria?
Thank you, Rihanna. It's a really good question, and I think the answer depends to a great extent on the journal that you're submitting to. So I thought I would answer the question by thinking about biometrics. So I think that's of relevance to many people attending today. So novelty is important, but it's certainly not the only criterion. And in fact, I'd like to sort of relabel it as clearly making a contribution, because I think that's a bit more flexible and allows slightly wider scope in what you mean by novelty. To support that, I think what you need in a good methodology paper is, in biometrics, is a clear motivation and practical importance. And that's not true for every journal, but it's very important in biometrics. You need to place your contribution properly in the literature because people need to be able to see clearly for themselves how it fits in. And then you also need to demonstrate that the contribution really is there. And you might do that by showing theoretical results and or including a simulation. Typically for statistics journals, you would need both. And then finally, you need a comparison with the existing methods. This relates to placing your work in the literature, but very often if you fail to do this, the immediate reaction is, okay, there may be a contribution, but you haven't demonstrated it. And so it's not a good paper. You can usually get this advice in the aims and scope of the journal or in the instructions for authors. So I always recommend reading that and following the advice and instructions. In the case of biometrics, there's strict page limits. If you don't follow those, you'll get your paper back immediately. So it's really worth reading them and making sure you follow the advice.
Thanks, Alan. Anyone, Andrew or Kate, do you have anything else to add?
No, I thought that was a great answer from Alan. I would agree. It doesn't have to be novel per se, but you have got to make it clear what your contribution is. And that if that's not clear, that would be something I would ask them to clarify. So just being mindful of what the contribution is, I think is important.
Yeah, I'd probably go further. I mean, I agree entirely with everything Alan said there, that contribution is the key. And if the contribution is not clear, the authors may not get an opportunity to clarify, depending on how harsh the reviewers are. If the reviewers can't see a contribution, they might say so, and then the paper may get rejected because of lack of clear contribution. Because I can, for statistical methods in medical research, about 10%, well, they quote 10% of papers that are submitted go through to acceptance. So it's pretty
pretty
tough
low.
benchmark. I'm not sure what it is in biometrics, but
It's in the
probably
low
not that-
20s.
right. Yeah.
So Andrew, my next question is for you. Can you briefly describe your process for reviewing methodology papers and how this compares to reviewing applied papers?
Right. Okay. For reviewing methodology papers. Yeah. Okay. So I'll start off when I first joined the Statistical Methods in Medical Research editorial board, which I was very excited about. It was essentially a glorified reviewer role rather than sort of an associate editor role, where I reviewed about a paper every month, and a lot of those papers took me out of the comfort zone, but I think that helped me transition into like an associate editor role. So I think so overall, when I was thinking about a process for reviewing methodology papers as compared to applied papers. So first thing, is it an area you know at least a little about? Typically reviewers are selected because so the process, paper gets submitted, the editor will assign the paper to an associate editor, and the associate editor will then select some reviewers to review the paper. So the associate editor typically has a brief look at the paper and then selects reviewers who either they know are working in the similar area or people whose work is referenced quite a bit in the paper. So, when you receive a request to review, typically someone has looked at it and your name has come up as someone who has at least a little bit of knowledge in the area. But first thing to do is really to say, do I know at least a little bit about this? And if you feel like it's really not in your area, as I think Myra mentioned as well too, it's okay to say you don't wish to do the particular review, but answer it quickly. Don't sort of dilly-dally for too long and then say, no, I don't want to do the review. But typically there is a screening process. So if you've received an invitation for a methodology paper, typically someone has thought you have got background in the area. Then just in terms of actually conducting a review, so methodology papers can be a little bit intimidating at times. And if you start going through reading every micro detail of the paper, first instance, you might only be on page 2 after Myra's sort of notional figure of 3 hours there. So read the whole paper broadly, omitting the technical details, but just try and get an idea of what they're doing. And so don't get too bogged down in the details early on. And so form an initial idea what you think about the contribution of the paper and how they've approached it. Only then would you go into the methods and have a more detailed look at how they've approached things. Now, I don't believe it's the reviewer's responsibility to check every single technical line of the paper, and I'd be interested in Alan's and Kate's thoughts maybe when we come into the discussion about whose responsibility is it, because papers can get, in SMMR, papers can get quite technical in there, but you should have an idea of what they're doing, but not have to reproduce every line. And sometimes in terms of an algebraic derivation, they might skip out multiple lines in their derivation. You don't need to go and fill in every piece. Then Alan also mentioned about sort of simulations and case studies, and I think they're really important there, that for a methodology paper, there'll be typically use simulations of the new method that's being proposed and comparing to the standard methods. So really do the simulations cover the required breadth of cases to be able to do a fair comparison against the existing methodology? Or are they sort of cherry picked? Oh, it's very hard to tell, but are they cherry picked to show where the new method has advantages over the standard method, but they might have skipped over cases where the opposite might have been the case? So to have a close look at the simulations and see, if they've covered the required breadth. Then in SMMR, often there's a case study, but not always. But for the reader, sometimes the case study is the most important part of the paper, where the practical problem is laid out and the methodology should be described very clearly how it applies to this particular practical problem. And it can be the most useful part for the reader to see, hey, this methodology really can have an impact. And if I use these other standard methods, I get these results. This new methodology maybe gives a more precise result or less bias in some way. So it's a combination of results from the simulations where you've looked at issues like bias, and then the application is really important. How readily can it be implemented into a real study? And it's important to be able to provide enough about the code to be able to reproduce or to be able to conduct the analyses of the case study. I don't mean that you have to go and actually reproduce all the results of a case study by having the code there, by running the code, but having the code available is really important. I think that's probably for methodology papers, but compared to what Myra said about applied papers, so applied papers you can almost think of as what I mentioned for a case study. It would be a really extended case study. The case study has to be important, and all of the elements of the analysis in the case study would be needed, basically along the lines of what Myra had said, and then using guidelines such as Consort and Stratos, etc. for that. So I'll stop it there, and yeah, maybe we can come back to some of these when we have questions.
Yep, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Kate or Alan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just add a couple of comments. The paper that's sent to you as a referee may not fit you perfectly. There's usually a couple, at least one, maybe two other referees and the AE looking at it. And you might have been selected because one part of the paper fits you very, very well. And the AE is particularly interested in your thoughts on that. They know you aren't an expert on all the other corners of the paper. And so you shouldn't think, okay, I'll only handle a paper which I can review in its entirety. It's often much more helpful to just focus on the bits you're really familiar with and just remind the AE that you don't know about the other bits. I agree with Andrew that it's the author's responsibility to have the proofs stand up. And I think if you're very interested or it's highly relevant to you, you can check them. But by and large, you're checking plausibility, whether it intuitively makes sense, and also how it all looks. I mean, if there's evidence that's very sloppy and casual, then you distrust it. If it looks carefully done, then it looks okay.
Great, thanks for that.
Just to follow up Alan's point there about, so I think it's perfectly fine as a reviewer to say, I'm focusing more on the practical applications of this study and not have to address every element. So that's a really important point Alan said. And often the associate editors will pick a reviewer who they know has got the really technical expertise, and then someone who's got the experience in the practical application of the paper. So thanks for raising that, Alan. That's really important.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, doing a review of a methodology paper, as I'm sure you can imagine, is quite a bit harder and quite a bit more daunting than a clinical paper, where clinical papers follow more of a formulae. You know, you want to know the background follows on to the objectives, and then that they're addressed using the right methodology, and you've collected the right data, and it's made a sensible conclusion. So they're kind of they follow a bit more of a formula. I think methodology papers, because they come in all different shapes and sizes, are a bit harder to review, but they should still tell that same story. You know, they should still have a background that then leads into the gaps in the literature. Hence, the aim is then the methodology should match the aims, and the conclusion should go back to the question. So that, you know, that's one thing to look through. And then I was just going to, one thing Myra said in her presentation is about the length of reviews. So she was saying 1 to 3 pages. I think a 3-page review would be quite a long review. And importantly, if you're reading it and you have major issues with it, there's a big fundamental flaw, then all the minor comments aren't really worth making. Because if you get to the point where you think it's, you know, should be rejected or major revision, going through and pointing out spelling errors and grammatical things, and it gets to the point where you could spend hours writing a 6-page review because this paper's not very good, or you could point out the handful or whatever of fundamental flaws and leave it there. So don't feel you have to fill 3 pages, like I say, and if you do find things wrong with it, they're the key things, and the review can kind of end there.
Good advice, thank you. Kate, my next question is for you. What should you look for in an invitation to review to know whether you have the skills to review the paper or whether it's beyond your skills? So Alan maybe touched on this a little bit, if you've got something more to add.
Yeah, so I think we have touched on this a bit. It's not an easy question. Obviously, when you get your invite, you get the abstract, so you have some kind of idea. I mean, especially at the beginning, I would stick to something that's in your field. But as Alan and Andrew have both said, and Myra was saying, you don't have to be an expert in everything. So, you know, I work a lot in missing data, multiple imputation. I might get a paper that's about multiple imputation and causal inference. So I kind of know that one bit's mine, and typically the associate editor would have somebody more of an expert in causal inference as the other reviewer to kind of balance it out. I also, when I'm looking, tend to think about what my strengths are. So I know I've done a lot of simulation studies in my time, but I'm not great at the kind of the algebra, the theoretical proofs and all that. So if I get an invite to review, I tend to look at what the aim of that paper is and how kind of mathematical versus simulation it's going to be, and think about whether that's going to be appropriate for me reviewing. But as the others have said, don't be too scared, because you're not expected to be reviewing every part of a paper or be an expert in everything about a paper. So yeah, especially at the beginning, try and pick something in your area, and then you'll feel a bit more confident and can perhaps branch out a little bit. But don't feel you have to be an expert in everything. And I don't know, Andrew, Alan, do you have anything, or anyone else, in fact, anything to add?
Just a comment there about when Myra mentioned blinded reviews or not. So the 3 journals we're talking about, sort of biometrics, statistics, medicine, SMMR, they're all the reviewers are all anonymized and blinded and not open to, the reviews are not open to the general public. So that allows a little bit more leeway, I think, in providing a review where you focus on the part of the paper that you feel you've got the expertise on. You don't have to cover everything. Whereas in an open review, when you've got your name publicly attached to it, I think I think that's a little trickier. But I'm not aware of any pure methodology journals that require the reviewers' names to be explicit. Because even journals like BMC, Medical Research Methodology, the reviewer has the option to have their name attached or not.
I was just going to add, I think we might have said this, but you can, in your letter, you know, you write a block, obviously, to the review, to the authors, but you also write to the editor. And I've said before, you know, I've reviewed this bit in detail, but I haven't reviewed, you know, that particular proof or whatever it might be. So you can indicate to them what you feel like you've confidently reviewed and which bits you haven't. So that, it's useful to do that sometimes.
Yeah, no, I agree with those comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks all. So at this point, I've asked a few questions, and I was hoping that maybe some of the attendees might have their own questions that they're interested in putting to our panel. So if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat and I'm happy to read it out. So please do that. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I can keep going with a few of my own. So, oh, looks like I've got a question from Simon. So Simon, you happy to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That was just fantastic. First of all, just that was a great presentation, Myra, and excellent question answering by the panelists. I was just wondering, Andrew, you spoke about sort of reproducibility and including code. But not necessarily that as a reviewer you might be expected to run the code, but that it's good to see if it's there. What would you do if there was no code, but you sort of thought that actually this would be a case where it's definitely of use for code to have been included?
Yeah, so even if the reviewers didn't say code should be provided, as an associate editor, I would be requesting that myself from the authors. So I think one should assume that you should be providing at least some sort of sketch code with every paper, whether it's a methodology, some new method, or a simulation paper of comparing existing methods. So I think providing the code and the reproducibility aspects of that is really important, that everyone should expect that as standard now.
I just wanted to add that I definitely asked for it. When I'm looking at tutorial papers in ophthalmic epidemiology, I always ask for code in those tutorial papers.
I think it's increasingly required, and it's a good number of reviewers actually do seem to run it, because you get comments in the reports on how easy or difficult it was and how it's much slower than my code.
And just to expand in that a bit, I'd be interested in what others think too, but when it comes to the code and generally the supplementary material, and often the code would be part of the supplementary material, I don't particularly think it's the reviewer's responsibility to go through all that in detail. I mean, it's handy to have a look at what's there, whether it's useful, whether it makes a contribution, whether there's any glaring things wrong or missing, but I don't think it's the reviewer's job to go through that line by line or make sure the code runs. I don't know if anyone particularly disagrees. I mean, one of the editors at Stats in Med sent me as an associate editor this paper, and I think the supplementary material was like 80 pages. And the editor actually said to me as the associate editor, you're not expected to go through that supplementary material. And actually, when you publish a paper, the supplementary material isn't touched at all. It's just put up as a PDF or a Word document or whatever you submitted in. So I don't think that's typically peer reviewed.
Great, thanks for that. Any other questions from the audience? If not, if you do have a question and you don't want to unmute yourself, feel free to pop it in the chat. But otherwise, I can ask another question of Alan. Alan, how do you know when to recommend a paper to be accepted or rejected? So what is it that constitutes a major or minor flaw?
Yeah, another good question, and it often comes down to your judgment and experience. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes there is a major flaw. I think Andrew hinted earlier at sometimes there's a mistake that completely invalidates what you're saying or claiming. The ones I like as an editor is actually when it's completely out of scope for the journal. For example, it's a paper in modeling the stock market and it's sent to biometrics. It goes straight back and another tick on the list of tasks done. But more generally, I think what goes into the judgment are things like thinking about the nature and the extent of the changes that are going to be needed to make the paper acceptable. And this depends on whether they're very specific changes that are being asked for or much vaguer. Whether they're simple and you think, well, the author should be able to respond to that, or whether you're actually asking for a serious additional piece of research that's sort of needed to support the paper. And because in the latter case, it's really going to be a big task for the authors. Now, of course, it's a judgment as to where these things fit on the spectrum, but it's sort of what you've got to feed in. The other strange aspect, I think, in addition to the distance the paper has to travel to be accepted, is what you think the likelihood of the goal actually being achieved is going to be. Now that's a very difficult one because it's partly where the care and effort that went into the first submission starts to pay off. Because if the first paper is sloppy and badly written, you probably won't get a second chance. But if you took care and it shows that you tried really hard and you thought about a lot of things, and okay, you messed up on one part of it, you might get a lucky break and get a second chance. Some journals like the Australian New Zealand Journal of Statistics will give a second round of revision, if you like, to PhD students. It's part of the policy and it's a great idea. In the end, the paper has to be the same quality as any other paper, but you get a little bit longer and a bit more help getting there. The journals like Biometrics don't have the time for that. And so the final criterion that comes in is trading off, trying to be fair to the author with the fact that there's an editor, an AE, and 2 or 3 other referees. So 5 other people's time being involved in helping you get there. And is it going to be a waste of their time to go through all of this again? So that's why I really always say to people, sweat the details in the first submission, make it as near perfectly close to submission as you can, and it'll often pay off in you getting a bit of a break in the second round.
That's really great advice and actually really interesting. I didn't know that Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics had that policy regarding PhD student submissions. I think it's a really good initiative.
Yeah.
I do have a question in the chat from Jessie Hansen. She says, really interesting discussion, thank you. I am a PhD student and am wondering when is an appropriate time in a research career to begin reviewing? It's a great question.
Is the answer now? I know Jessie, yeah. she's in our group, so welcome Jessie. She's only just started a few weeks ago. I think the mentorship scheme is a good one. Perhaps I can throw it back to you, Rihanna, because you were saying you've just been you've just been involved in doing a review like that. Maybe you could sort of talk about the process there, because I think that's excellent.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a PhD student. I finished my PhD in 2017, 2018 back then, and then I worked for 2 years at the University of Melbourne primarily in a teaching position. So I didn't do a whole lot of research except for some projects related to my PhD. And then moved to the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, working underneath Kate, actually in multiple imputation research. And I've only just done my first co-review, and that's nearly probably 3 or 4 years after my PhD. So this was when I was sort of ready and when I was in the kind of role where that was more a requirement or more of something that you do to build up in that role. My previous role, I wouldn't have sort of got to that point. But I think the thing is, being in this role in the Research Institute, have a lot of support to do that. And Kate was really helpful with me when I was doing my review. I had a first go at it, wrote down all my comments. She read through them, read the paper, had a look at my comments, helped me revise things where needed and added things where needed. Kate, you've had a few maybe students or people postdocs underneath you have been in this situation. When do you recommend they start peer review?
I was going to say, I thought you were a little bit later, Rihanna. I think that's possibly, I mean, you moved fields a bit from being more, general statistics into biostatistics, but, you kind of did yours, you'd finished, submitted, had accepted your first paper and were kind of working on your second paper. So I feel like you have to have been through the process, at least once. So for you, Jessie, who's just starting out, I would, wait till you've finished actually going through the whole submission process, reviewers' comments, so you get to see it for yourself. But I don't think, apart from that, you can start too early. So, in the last year or so of your PhD, when you've got a paper, I think that's a really good time. I had another student finish her PhD or submit her PhD a month or 2 ago, and I did a review with her, mentoring her through a review as well. So I think, kind of that last year of your PhD is a good time to start thinking about it. And your supervisor can often find you a paper because, they're probably getting reviews reasonably often and can't do them all. And so, offering one of their PhD students is a good way of doing it. And it was, you know, it was quicker for me than doing a review for myself. I did the one with Rihanna because she did a lot of the grunt work, and I read the paper and thought of the major comments I'd say, and then we, you know, I looked at her notes and just tweaked them a bit. Or I can't remember if there was anything that I thought she hadn't noticed, but you know, it was a lot quicker for me to do it too. So I think starting, you know, like I say, late PhD, but with a mentor or with someone co-doing it with you is a really good idea.
If I can just jump in again, I think it depends if it's an applied paper or a methodology paper. Certainly a methodology paper, I think you do need a few years experience under, and so beginning PhD student, I think that would be extremely difficult. But I think an applied paper, if it's in the area of your PhD with the help of the supervisor, I think that could be done within the first couple of years. I think that might be good experience.
Yeah, I think also if you've written or you've sort of co-authored a few applied papers, probably makes it a bit easier, because I came from a very methodological, like very methods background all the way through uni, and this was my first job sort of where I had some applied stats experience, and that was an applied paper. So there are a few more questions or comments in the chat. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I've got a comment here from Katrina Blazek. Is it the reviewer's job to suggest appropriate statistical methods if there are problems with the methods that have been used, or should we just point out potential problems with the method and allow the authors the opportunity to defend their decision?
I think you can do both. You can make suggestions, but you can also leave it to them. Sometimes making the suggestion clarifies why you feel their method is inappropriate and can be helpful, but it just depends on the situation.
I think that's a nice short answer to wrap things up. And just one final comment from Simon in the chat. My first review went, like Kate suggested, final year of my PhD after I've had a few publications, and my supervisor handballed me a review that we worked through together. I think we've got 1 minute left, so maybe a very, very quick answer. Question from Emmy here. If the statistical methodology or application results is good, but the narrative or grammar is quite poor, what do you do as editor? Maybe English isn't your first language in this situation.
Well, different journals have different support for this. Wiley, for example, has support which I think you can pay for. We often, the mildest thing is say it's not the journal or the referee's job to correct all the English and grammar, and please could they find a colleague who would help them with the English. That's the mildest. It's a potential slippery slope where you get all sorts of problems, and again, if the paper's borderline and terribly written with all sorts of English problems, it's just human that you're not going to go through it again.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there because it's already 2 o'clock, but I just wanted to say a really, really big thank you to Myra, Andrew, Catherine, or Kate and Alan for joining us today. It was a really, really useful seminar, and I think hopefully the other attendees on the line have gotten something out of it as well. Thanks very much, everyone.